Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Real Talk. My name is Jim Schottenham, curator at the American Museum of Fly Fishing, and I'm coming to you today from the Gardner Grant Library here at our Manchester, Vermont campus. We're going to be talking about a number of interesting reels today. I think that you'll find some interesting tidbits of information, and I have a follow-up to a previous episode of Real Talk. So with all of that, I think we're going to jump right in. Recently, the members of the American Museum of Fly Fishing were able to access our new member forum. And in that forum, there's a section that's called Ask the Curator. And I do from time to time receive emails asking particularly about reels. So I thought I would take the opportunity to talk a little bit about fishing reels in general. The questions that I get not only ask for identification and the maker and the year, but oftentimes I'm asked what the purpose of a particular fishing reel is. So we'll start with the kind of the general view of a fishing reel. Of course, we tend to focus in on fly reels here at the Fly Fishing Museum, but certainly when reels first became popular with the European and certainly the Americans, reels were just more or less general purpose. Some of the earliest reels that were depicted look very much like what were termed Indiana-style reels, and we'll get into those in just a little bit. But for the most part, reels were simply a place to store your line. Multiplying reels came along a little bit afterwards, of course, but for the most part, a fishing reel could be used for any type of angling, whether you were fishing for panfish, for trout, for pike, for salmon, for saltwater species, anything that you had to withhold a line early on, you could use anything for a reel. In fact, some instances, there are anglers that would use just a stick. They'll wind a line around a stick. They'll use a can of soda, a Coca-Cola or Pepsi can, just wind the line around that. We, of course, have come quite a ways from some of those crude reels. But to start with, I'm going to see if I can't share my screen here with you. In lieu of that, we're going to get started here with, bear with me for just 1 second. Okay, so here you see what's an Indiana-style reel. And this is something that was depicted in a very early Chinese painting that showed a turtle fisherman using this type of reel to catch those turtles. Oftentimes, people refer to these as fly reels, or you hear people refer to the Indiana-style reels as ice fishing reels. In fact, what these were intended to be used for and were advertised as such, they were casting reels. They advertised them as great for not getting a backlash. The large radius would be great for picking up a lot of line with the single turn of a handle. And certainly this, as with any other reel, can be used for pretty much anything you wanted to, but its design was more or less for casting. Could you use this as a fly reel? Of course you could. It wouldn't be the best option. You could use this for casting for bass. You could use it for trout fishing, salmon fishing, pretty much any type of fishing you wanted to do. But it would be most better served as just that, a casting reel. They do take a little getting used to, but they do work. What a lot of people use early on too, I'm going to switch my cameras up here just a second. Give you a view of this little reel. Is something that you would have seen early on. And this is just a very simple brass gearless reel. The clamp, of course, would have been placed on the rod. That is, again, it's more or less a general purpose reel. This type of reel would have been utilized again for everything from largemouth and smallmouth bass, trout fishing, pan fishing, any type of fishing that you could use this reel for. They were made in various sizes. If you wanted to use larger line, of course, you may choose a larger diameter reel. But these single action brass type reels were pretty common among fishermen in the early part of the 19th century. And by and large, early 19th century in America too. So once again, you can see these listed from people as fly reels, casting reels, children's reels, depending on what size they are, salmon reels and the like. These were just a general purpose fishing reel. It wouldn't be until later that reels started to become more refined. If some are familiar with some of the past episodes, you may recall that I talked about an early Kentucky style reel that's often thought of as just a casting reel. And that was advertised as the small size, as perfect for trout. And it was a small multiplying reel. So, and of course, there's other types of reels. There's wooden trolling reels. I've got an example that I'll share with you here today. So there's just a large number of types of reels. But for the most part, you could use any type of reel for any type of fishing that you wanted. It does get a little confusing sometimes because of the way a reel may look. And I can certainly understand that. But one of the reels that we're going to be talking about today, and we'll start right in with this one, it's an Edward vom Hofe reel, and it is a Colonel Thompson reel. Colonel Thompson was born in 1866, passed away in 1936, was an avid outdoorsman. And Colonel Thompson approached the vom Hofe family, Edward in particular, to produce a dry fly salmon reel, which is what you're seeing here. And I'll see if I can't get that a little better focus for you. The other thing I'm going to try to do here, we'll share our screen. There is a much better photo of the Colonel Thompson reel. So this reel was, again, a dry fly salmon reel. And this was produced in 1925 by Edward vom Hofe. This is the only reel made in this configuration for dry fly salmon fishing. It is a multiplier. And as you can see, the reel looks very much like any other vom Hofe saltwater multiplier. The difference between this reel and a standard saltwater reel was that this was made particularly for those dry fly fishing. It also features on the backside a drag adjustment that looks much like you would find on the Restigouche reels and other salmon reels and fly reels of that type. It's easy to overlook this pretty scarce reel if you're not familiar with the Colonel Thompson setup. The purpose of this was to fish rivers like the Restigouche with a slack line and a drag-free presentation. Now, part of the reason I suspect that this reel wasn't very long, from 1925 to 1928, that handle is problematic for fly anglers. When you're stripping line off the reel, those loops would easily tangle behind that S-shaped handle that you see. So the reels didn't last in the catalogs very long. In fact, in 1928 was the last year that the Colonel Thompson reel was cataloged. In that same year, the vom Hofe Tabeek was advertised. The Tabeek was much like the Restigouche reel that we'll get into next. Looked much more like your standard salmon reel. The Restigouche being a single action, and the Tabeek was a multiplier. So again, we're looking at what appears to be and easily confused with a saltwater reel, but this in fact is a pretty tough Colonel Thompson reel. The catalog cut describes this reel, and I'll read it to you because that print is kind of fine. The catalogs describe this as extra fine quality rubber. The metal was all white metal except the spool, which is made of aluminum. It had metal safety bands, of course, the S-shaped handle, steel click cog and ratchet, double sounding sliding click, and the universal automatic silent tension drag, patented in 1896. This reel was very expensive, and in the 1925 catalog, this reel listed for $60. So it was not an inexpensive thing by any stretch. And I'll swap this over so you can get a better look at it. But this is what I was referring to with the drag adjustment. And you'll see that is something that you would find on the other Vom Hofe reels. But on the tailplate of this particular reel, it's a giveaway that this is a Colonel Thompson. In addition, you want to look for the model number, which in this particular case, this is a 1/0 size reel, and it's stamped 484. The stamping is a little difficult to see. It is on the bottom of the foot, but again, this is a pretty tough reel. This reel, in fact, belonged at one point to Dean Sage Jr. Dean Sage, of course, another famous salmon angler who fished the Restigouche. So it's got a pretty important history, beside the fact that it's a pretty tough reel. So that's the first reel that we're going to talk about today. The next reel that we're going to discuss is another reel from the Vom Hofe family. It's the Vom Hofe Restigouche. The Restigouche was one of the longest running reels in the Vom Hofe catalogs. And get to that one. That is a Vom Hofe Restigouche model 423 single action salmon reel. One point I'd like to make while we're looking at this reel, as I mentioned, was cataloged from the earliest days, all the way up until the last Vom Hofe catalog, when Ocean City was manufacturing the reels, all the way to 1950. But what's interesting is that from the earliest catalogs, predating 1900, all the way up until 1928, the catalog cut for the Restigouche reel was exactly the same. It showed a reel with the 1879 patent that featured indentations underneath that drag wheel that you see just below the handle. So using catalogs is not always the best way to date a particular reel. The reel that you're seeing here has a little arrow pointer, which is the second version, if you will, of the Restigouche reel. That was introduced in was before 1918, and then later the dial was moved to the back of the reel, and it had a little flat lever. So I'm going to switch my view for you. Get a better shot at this. So there is that drag. It's a little, I apologize for the fuzziness there, but this is that drag wheel I was referring to, the little arrow pointer. And as I said, that's a good indication of age. This is the tailplate of the single action model 423 Restigouche. Had roller pillars, that little click switch, a little dome flat disc, a little dome with a knurled edge will also help indicate the age of the reel. And this was offered in a number of different sizes. The drag was moved around to the tailplate side, like you saw in the Colonel Thompson, around 1918. So that helps us date those reels as well. As I said, the configuration changed a little bit, but the photo that they use or the image that they used in the catalog remained the same up until the 1950s. So that is shown. Get to my catalog cut here. And there's the catalog page for the Restigouche. And you'll notice there's those indentations on the drag wheel in the earliest models of the Restigouche. So you can see it was offered in a number of sizes. The reel was a little less expensive than the Colonel Thompson. That retailed for between $32 and $35, depending on the size of the reel that you desired. But again, it was a very popular reel, one of the longest running reels that they had. And it was made of all German silver and hard rubber until about 1907. That's when you could order them with aluminum parts. In 1918, you could also get that with an aluminum spool. So that's kind of a neat reel. Again, you could use this for a number of species. You could use this for saltwater fishing and of course, salmon. It's a little on the large size to be used for anything other than that, but certainly it's a fishing reel. So if you so desired, you could use this for something other than what it was advertised for. All right, next up, we're going to be talking about a reel that's part of our study collection here at the museum. And this, again, is somewhat confusing to collectors simply because of the name. The English referred to this particular reel as a casting reel. This is an A. Allen. That's an Allen Spinet reel. This dates back to the 1920s. It's patented in 1926. It's essentially a copy, a copy of the Illingworth #2 reel, which is the first to use this more or less familiar spinning reel design. But because the English refer to this as a casting reel, of course, in America, we would refer to this as a spinning reel. Easy to see where collectors would get a little confused, but this is still one of the very first to use this traditional spinning reel design. The reel has a little half bail arm, which you can see down here. It also has an exposed gear. Now, the exposed gear early on, of course, once again, is somewhat problematic for anglers because that's something that would easily catch your line, and all you have to do is turn that handle once, and you're going to run into a problem. You're going to have a line kind of all tangled up in your reels. The later versions of this reel did have an enclosed housing, but the other interesting thing, that little pair of set screws right there operates a click. If you can hear that. And all that does is simply apply pressure to that little gear that you see under the spool here. These reels originally came with a slotted spool screw. This later version, of course, is a knurled nut that you see, but pretty much like the design that you see today on spinning reels. It hasn't changed a whole lot, but because of the confusion with spinning and the casting reels, as I said, sometimes they do get a little bit confused. So I'll show you catalog. There is the catalog that says very plainly that it is a Allen's lightweight casting spinet reel. So again, you could use this reel for pretty much anything. You could use this reel for trout, for bass, for panfish. You could use that for salmon, although it may be a little small. Salmon anglers could certainly utilize that for to target some of their fish. It was a design that carried over all the way to the Second World War, and of course after that the spinning craze kind of took over, and everyone refers to them today as spinning reels. The next reel we'll talk about today is a Milward reel. It's a Henry Milward & Son. It's a Nottingham style reel. This is a big guy. The Nottingham reel gets its name from the Trent River. They were introduced around the middle of the 19th century, around 1850 to 1860s. They were mostly single action, free running reels that were used much in the way that center pin reels are used today. The idea was that you would reduce the amount of drag, giving you a natural presentation. But these reels, again, were confused with saltwater reels. They're often called specifically fly reels. And as I said, they're not exactly wrong. These reels were multi-purpose. In fact, Jim Brown, in his book, Treasury of Reels, talks about the different styles of casting that anglers used when employing these reels. They would do two things. They would actually strip line from the reel as you would a modern fly reel with the coils laid under you, or they would use it as as I said, just casting straight from the reel, casting into the rivers and lakes to make their presentations. Now, these reels were made in all kinds of sizes, everywhere from 2-inch diameter up to 8-inch diameters. I'll show you that the tailplate on this one. This is interesting in that it's called, as you can might imagine from that, it's called a frog back because of the way that those supports are kind of splayed out. That was essentially used to provide a little more support for that wooden frame of the reel. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a better look at this. This is a big guy. This is a wooden trolling, trotting, fly, salmon, saltwater, sea. It could have been used for pretty much anything. This particular example of the Milward reel has this line guide here. That's a John Bickerdike style line guide. It has twin grasp, which was not uncommon. You can find them sometimes with a counterweight attached to them. But this large reel, because it was so big, was referred to oftentimes as a Scarborough reel because of the large size. Scarborough was from the an area of northeast England. These reels, when they were really popular in England, were never quite as popular in the United States. Certainly, United States manufacturers did produce wooden reels. They made them for trolling, and as I said, the smaller ones could have been used for fly. They could have been used for pretty much any type of fishing that you wanted to do. They're interesting reels to look at. They're made of oftentimes mahogany. They could have been made from cedar. But the one thing that these reels were susceptible to is drying out. And when they did that, of course, they would crack. So it was important to keep these in good shape. They were often made of brass components, and they're heavy. The one thing I'll say about the anglers that utilize those reels, when you consider the type of rods that they would need, you're looking at a 14, 16 or greater length, a heavy lancewood rod with that giant Scarborough wooden reel filled with a spool of wet line. That's going to really tire you out after a day's casting, making repeated casts out into the river or the lakes. That's going to really do a number on your arm. So it makes you appreciate some of the lightweight components, the graphites, the borons that we are all familiar with today, the incredibly lightweight fly reels that we have to balance out those delicate fly rods. So we're very fortunate that we've come quite a ways from using those. They still function today. You could put line on that reel. You could go out and catch salmon this afternoon if you wanted to. So again, when you hear people refer to them as a fly reel, certainly something the size of that Scarborough may be a bit large for that purpose, but it could be used for that. It could be used for pretty much anything you wanted to. The next reel up we'll talk about today, switched over again here. We're going to be talking about the Hendryx reels. Now, Hendryx reels are very interesting. They, of course, are also referred to as everything from ice fishing reels, children's reels, fly reels, trout reels, bass reels, you name it. Hendryx was a very prolific maker. They did produce all of those types of reels. But these little raised pillar brass single action reels were marketed just that, just a fishing reel. They're not specifically made for ice fishing, although you will find them often on tip-ups. The one thing I'll say about some of the reels made of metal, for anyone that lives in the north that has been ice fishing, they will tell you that if your hands get wet and you have to handle a metal reel in sub-freezing temperatures, it's not really comfortable. But again, that's what they had to use, so that's what they did use. The Hendryx reels were inexpensive. These are very similar to what Hendryx called their competitor reels. This particular reel that I'm showing on the screen is one of the Hendryx competitors. This reel is actually exhibited right now at our Springfield, Missouri satellite campus. So if you're in the area down there, you can certainly go and take a look at it. They were, as I said, more or less inexpensive. However, they were very functional, very popular. They were sold, at least the competitor, they were only sold per gross. It's 144 reels at $10.86 in 1904. So it was $10.86 for 144 reels minus a click. They were plain brass. If you wanted a click, you could get a gross for $13.50. These were all 40-yard size reels. And what's interesting is that according to the Hendryx catalog, the competitors being riveted, most of the reels were screwed. And in defense of their reels, they claimed that the handmade soft metal reels were heavy and used soldered connections. So they were touting the fact that there's less liability to injury from unavoidable accidents because Hendryx uses positive fastening methods. I'm not so sure what's not really positive about a threaded screw. I think that's a pretty positive connection, but nonetheless, it's what Hendryx advertised the reels for, or what as the reels as, I should say. Again, you'll find people referring to these as pretty much everything under the sun. They're not entirely wrong, but these were marketed just as fishing reels. And we'll go ahead and get a better look at that. This is a little guy, so I'm going to hold this up here. So here's a prime example of a little Hendryx reel, small reel. Sure, it could be used as a child's reel, it could be used for a panfish reel, any small water stream, any small pond, any place where you didn't really need a lot of line. You weren't casting about 75 to 100 yards across the lake. really inexpensive riveted construction, but you see a ton of these reels. And in fact, may not show up all that well, but on the foot of these Hendryx reels, you'll see the patent date of 1888. And people will often interpret that as this particular reel was made in 1888. It's not entirely true. They used that stamp for a number of years. So that date is not indicative of the year it would have been made or cataloged. But interesting reels nonetheless. What we're going to talk about next is also a reel that was advertised as a general purpose fishing reel. I'll share my screen here with you. We're going to show it's a Meisselbach reel. This is a Meisselbach Gogiebik. And this is one of the first reels that Meisselbach cataloged. This is part of their amateur series of reels introduced in the late 1880s. It was advertised through A.G. Spaulding of New York. And it's named after the Michigan county where that word was from. It's actually a Chippewa Native American word, which translates to where the trout makes rings upon the water, which I think is kind of neat. This particular reel, the earliest version of this amateur, this is the upright version. They did make a horizontal. Meisselbach advertised these reels both as trout and bass reels. So this is the advertisement that you'll find in the early Spaulding catalogs. And you'll, if you can read through that, I know it's kind of difficult, but basically what Meisselbach was advertising is if you were to place the reel behind your hand on the rod, that essentially would indicate you're fishing it as a trout reel. If you wanted to use it as a bass reel, you would simply use it on your rod mounted forward of your grasp. So the earliest reels, as I just mentioned, had that exposed click. Later reels click on the backside. They had a finger brake. So there's ways to identify the years that these were made. The reels were not stamped with Meisselbach's name. And I suspect early on that they were kind of advertising to the trade, looking to get as much exposure as they could. But there's two sizes of all these reels. And you can get a better look at that here in my hand. This is one of the smaller sizes. But again, that exposed click, if your line got anywhere near that gear while the reel was in use, trapping that line, it could mean landing that fish and not landing the fish. Another thing that's interesting about these reels, you'll notice that it has bars that make up the arbor. You can see your standard arbor all the way on the inside of the reel, but these bars essentially give this reel a rapid line retrieve, something akin to a multiplying reel. So for every turn of the handle, you would pick up a lot of line, something similar to a multiplying gear reel, without necessary gears. So again, something that was advertised as a general purpose reel. You could use this for pretty much anything. People will call them ice fishing reels. They'll call them trout reels, fly reels, bass reels. And once again, no one is entirely wrong. But Meisselbach did like to advertise those as kind of a general purpose reel. Which leads me to one thing that from one of our previous episodes, we had talked about Meisselbach rainbow reels. And for those familiar with the book, A Treasury of Reels, author Jim Brown was kind enough to share with us a rainbow reel that he has in his collection that we believe predates any of the rainbow reels that were cataloged by Meisselbach. So Jim's reel, as you can see, has a line guide, which is not featured in any of the Meisselbach catalogs, was not mentioned in any of their catalog descriptions. But this is certainly one of the earliest examples based on the other attributes of the reel. The horseshoe style handle, the foot is connected to the reel with 4 screws. That has that early grasp. And of course it is marked rainbow on the back. So by watching the episode that we did on this, Jim was kind enough to share, which of course is something that we all appreciate learning. Thank you, Jim, for sharing your reel. And I hope that people that have seen some of the others, you're inclined to share some of your findings as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this webinar and this episode of Real Talk. I encourage you, if you're not already a member of the museum, to please join. And of course, if you have any questions about reels, I can be reached through the museum website. And for the members that have used the member portal, there is a forum there. And one of the topics is Ask the Curator. So if you have a question about a reel, I'd be happy to try and answer for you. And I encourage you all to go visit, if you have the opportunity, the satellite campus we have in Springfield, Missouri. And I wish you all a wonderful day. Thank you.